It's very nice to see you all here today. I'm Bill Granara. I'm the director for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard, and I'm the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies of the Tunisia Center, the office here in Tunisia as well. It's very nice to have you all here. Thank you very much for coming. I'll be brief with my introduction, and I'm hoping there'll be a very nice Q&A following the talk. It gives me great pleasure to introduce not only my colleague, a great scholar, but a wonderful friend, Laryssa Chomiak, who you all know, I'm sure, is the director for CEMAT. CEMAT is the Tunisia branch of the AIMS, the American Institute for Maghrebine Studies. We have 4 sites in North Africa, and I venture to say that CEMAT is the most illustrious, having been a former CMET recipient, so I can say that as well. So we're all in very good company tonight. In addition to being the director for the Center for Maghreb Studies in Tunis, Laryssa is also an associate fellow at Chatham House in London, a very prestigious research institute that's been around for many, many years. Today, her talk, Archipelagos of Dissent. I can't pronounce that word, it just won't roll off my tongue, but I think I got it right, close to correct. Protest and Politics in Tunisia is also, Laryssa tells me, the name of her forthcoming book. Today she is going to talk about this, and again it's in connection to her forthcoming book. Laryssa has her bachelor's degree from Fordham University, where she majored in political science and Middle Eastern studies, and she did her PhD at the University of Maryland in political science and government. Her areas of research are quite broad. Not only is she a political scientist, but she's also works in comparative politics, international relations, and also she works on post-Soviet states as well, and her CV will show that she works on a very wide, broad area. Without embarrassing her, and I don't think she gets embarrassed too much, Laryssa is one of the, a real star generation, particularly in the Anglophone world. She's a leading scholar in the field of North African Middle Eastern politics. And for those of you who may not know, North African studies has long been in the purview of Francophone studies, and it's only been in the last maybe a generation and a half, going on 2 generations, where North African studies, Maghrebi studies, has really come to full fore in the Anglophone world, not only in the United States, but also in England as well. And it's safe to say, I'm very confident to say that Laryssa is now among what I would say I won't say the elder statesmen yet because she's much too young, but she's definitely in the Hizmet Hakim, if I can say that, of North African studies in the United States. Just to mention a couple of titles, and her CV is wide, I want to just give you a couple of names of things that she has done, her articles. And her articles are not only published in peer-reviewed journals, but also Washington Post. She's now become a public intellectual of sorts once you start publishing in the Washington Post. You're on Donald Trump's radar screen, so in some ways you're a public intellectual. But among some of her titles, The Revolution in Tunisia Continues, 2016, Architecture and Resistance in Tunisia, 2014, Spectacles of Power, Locating Resistance in Ben Ali's Tunis, 2013, Civil Society in Transition, The Experiences of Centers for Abused Women in Morocco. She also has published several pieces on Ukraine, her native land. She is quadrilinguist, she's bilingue deux fois. How's that? Is that okay? Her native languages are Ukrainian and German. Her English, I don't know where she learned her English, but she learned her English very quickly, and also in French. So her research areas are wide and deep, and I'm sure today she's going to give us a tremendous talk, after which I hope you challenge her on some really good, tough questions, because I think she'll like that. Okay? Anyway, my friend, my colleague, my esteemed Laryssa.
So thank you. I don't have this kind of thank you for you, so already I'm embarrassed. But thank you to Bill and particularly to CM for inviting me to speak about my book project today. Thank you to all my colleagues and friends for making the time to attend this lecture today, and also to the many students and faculty from Cambridge who are visiting in Tunis. It's a great honor to be here. Before I dive into my I'm going to read out my lecture, which is about 22 minutes long. I wanted to warn you. This is not about contemporary politics. This is about a different era. So I've tried my best to kind of take us back to a different period where research looked very different, where also politics appeared to be different, and kind of my goal is for us to think about what things were like and how they might resemble or might not resemble what is going on right now. As Bill said, I'm a political scientist by training. I take an ethnographic and critical approach, so there will not be many numbers, but there'll be lots of kind of extraction of meaning about a particular era. My lecture today, Archipelagos of Dissent, which also took me a while to pronounce. But then my husband, who's a brilliant linguist, kind of made me practice it over and over and over again by explaining what it actually means, multiple waters. So my lecture today, Archipelagos of Dissent, is also the title, as Bill said, of my monograph on Tunisian politics, which is based on research primarily before the rupture of 2011. The book examines how a state attempts to persuade citizens of its benevolent power through an ambiguous strategy of forging loyalty, even as it is grounding its edifices in a system of repression. With particular attention to the symbolic and aesthetic elements of the state, that is the public cult of personality that was developed over time, the workings of the state is approached beyond its repressive and coercive apparatus on which most modern states are constructed. And I will give examples of what this looks like in just a moment. We know that the system was significantly challenged at moments, and this study focuses on the ways in which different modes of dissent became possible. I examine forms of dissent through the limitations of the state and under which particular conditions they occurred. My intent is thus not to examine a specific opposition, ideology, or a particular movement, though of course these figure prominently throughout the different book chapters, but rather to find out under what conditions and how dissent worked pre-2011. The book's core findings come from 2 years of intensive field research between 2008 and 2010, then for my doctoral dissertation. Since then, the scope of this project, particularly its theoretical and conceptual contribution, has shifted significantly as a result of ongoing follow-up research with my original interlocutors. So these are ongoing conversations over the last 10 years now, and the ability to expand discussions and issues in the political environment post-2011. So those of us who were looking at questions of power prior to 2011 know that the research environment was significantly more constrained, particularly for foreign researchers. So today's lecture will begin with an anecdote about a mode of resistance in the early 2000s. It provides a snapshot of how the relationship between power and resistance was told in the last decade of Zine Abidine Ben Ali's rule. I will then link it to the principal argument of the book and end with 2 main contributions, theoretical and conceptual. Conceptually, the book approaches observations of resistance, socio-political contention, and protest as interstitial phenomena, something that appears to occur at intervals or something that occurs as intervening space segments. This includes sarcasm, imaginaries, collective defiance in sporting events, wildcat strikes, street-based rebellions and protest, as well as pacts and writings by the opposition in exile and in hiding in Tunisia. It provides a theory of resistance that ruptured dictatorship, but it occurred in non-institutionalized and somewhat diffused ways. That is, not necessarily through elections, civil society organs, and other detectable forms of political participation. I chose the term archipelago in my title because these moments of defiance occurred through different means, by different actors, at different times, in different locations, embodying different grievances and different histories. Though different, they were linked in that each instance envisioned an alternative social, political, and economic order. At moments, these came together, as in 2011, but most importantly, they provided the possibilities for envisioning what an alternative politics would look like. This element is an addition and perhaps corrective to Anglophone political science work on the authoritarian syndrome that dominated analysis on the Middle East and North Africa for over 2 decades and is now making a comeback, especially post-2013, post-2014. Secondly, the book theorizes time by tracing large moment of contention historically and politically for analytical purchase over commencing analysis with moments of ruptures or forcing a before and after effect. This has occurred in much social science work post-2011, where research projects are driven by a desire to study difference of something that occurred after 2011 to what occurred before. This temporal comparison is not wrong per se. There's nothing wrong with looking at things today and then linking them to other moments before. But rather, it concentrates analytical importance in a post-revolutionary period, that is the last 8 years, singles out specific actors, and employs only selective moments and narratives of the past. Narratives, historian Michel Rolf Trujillo writes, necessarily distort life. And I seek to be especially conscious and careful of how and why this occurs. The mode of Tunisian politics I studied did not end on January 14th and recommenced that afternoon after Ben Ali's departure. Of course, this moment did profoundly alter things. It brought previously banned political actors to the fore. It created chaos and fear among members of the previous regime. It opened the possibility for new forms of political engagement and a restructuring of the relationship between the state and citizen. And it ushered in both a period of incredible hope and massive disappointment. This book is largely a backstory to these dynamics. All right. In October 2001, a German tourist vacationing at the Hotel Lido in the village of Dar Shaban el-Fehri, adjacent to the popular tourist towns of Nabil and Hammamet in the Gabon, sent a postcard to the German daily Berliner Zeitung with a puzzling one-line message. Viele Grüße aus der Straße, die es nicht gibt. Greetings from the street that does not exist. Intrigued and alarmed by the cryptic note, the newspaper contacted other international outlets to further investigate and publicize this curious postcard. Why would a local daily paper respond in such a dramatic way to an anonymous postcard and potential hoax? The backstory here is very significant. On October 13th, 2001, a town hall councillor to the Dar Shaban Municipal Council proposed an initiative to rebaptize the name of the ubiquitous 7th of November Avenue to the Avenue of the Martyr Mohammed Mansouri. The proposal was problematic. Major Mansouri was accused of planning a coup d'etat against former President Habib Bourguiba to be organized on November 8th, 1987, the day after Ben Ali came to power. Mansouri was arrested, tortured, and died in incarceration along with hundreds of other security and military personnel in an internal purge only 4 weeks after Zine Abidine Ben Ali came to power. Council members recognized that the designation martyr would most certainly alarm Carthage, which is the presidential palace and the seat of political power. While the initiative passed with an absolute majority, at least one informant delegate notified authorities in Tunis, who viewed the rebaptism as an act of rebellion and a clear attack against the state. The Ministry of Interior immediately dissolved the municipal council and replaced it with a hand-picked provisional council that would run municipal affairs until the next elections. The relatively severe clampdown fueled discontent among the residents of Dar Shaban. 2 days after the municipal council was dissolved, residents mobilized and in an early morning act of sabotage covered all November 7th street signs with banners reading Avenue of the Martyr Mohammed Mansouri. In a panic, the governor of Nabil ordered police forces to remove the banners and placed November 7th street signs under 24-hour surveillance. Police forces were mobilized to protect every street sign along November 7th Avenue, to patrol the town and to identify the transgressors. The sudden amplified police presence failed to intimidate the residents, who upped the ante in their creative campaign by addressing and posting hundreds of letters to the Avenue Mansouri. Inundated with a barrage of letters, the following morning, the post office notified the Ministry of the Interior, which ordered its special research unit to examine the letters. Despite the Ministry of Interior's reactions, the residents of Dar Shaban persisted in their defiance. When a tourist would ask for the Hotel Lido, the pharmacy, or the main grocery store, they were directed to the Avenue Mansouri. Cab drivers, notorious informants during the Ben Ali regime, were instructed by the Ministry of Interior handlers to inform police of provocative requests for a ride to the Avenue Mansouri. And in response to the time receptionists and concierges at hotels spent explaining to tourists that Mansouri Street did not exist, the official tourism office eventually ordered each hotel to affix a huge plaque in each lobby hotel, "There is no Mansouri Street," ironically, in 7 languages. That regime strategy too failed. The lobby signs became mini tourist attractions, and the most inquisitive tourists attempted to visit Mansouri Street to take a picture of the street that did not exist. The only street in Tunisia where November 7 street signs were protected by armed police officers and where photographs were expressively forbidden. In an unpredictable turn of events, police officers too found themselves ensnarled in the story, mistakenly and illegally telling their family and friends, "Tomorrow I'm protecting the street plaques on Avenue Mansouri." The enraged Minister of Interior reacted by issuing strict orders. Every police officer who pronounced the word Mansouri would appear before the disciplinary board, while all entry to the avenue required special permission until the situation calmed down. So, this story, as I'm sure you can tell, of creative resistance in a small tourist town is entirely fictitious. Fictitious. C'est pas vrai. C'est imaginaire. Because of its use of a real town, streets, and symbols of the regime, as well as narration of real experiences, such as peaceful resistance and mundane administrative practice, the narrative appears to be real, a technique often used by Omar Khayyam, his alias, and other cyber dissidents in the online publication Tunisine. Tunisine was a principal platform developed in the early 2000s, in addition to 3 to 4 or maybe more other similar such platforms, that opponents of all political orientations used. But it too was the primary site that individuals, such as Omar Khayyam, employed to subvert, mock, critique, ridicule, and essentially challenge the unpopular politics and repressive methods of the Ben Ali regime. In my own conversations with Omar Khayyam, a formal poster worker who moved abroad in the 2000s and only returned after 2011, he stresses the anonymity of his work and that of his colleagues, many of whom only met years later and after Tunisia ceased operating. At that time, 10 years before 2011, many will remember that these types of acts were not only heavily censored, but more importantly deemed illegal. Some of the imaginaires were so convincing that at moments its readers believed them to be true, while most surprisingly, in a few cases, the international press picked up on stories as real instances of either domination or possibly resistance. And the most famous story that was picked up by a Swiss news outlet is a story of mandatory prayer badges that individuals needed to own in order to enter mosques and pray. Sarcastic essays were but one form of regime defiance, and I was particularly struck by the one I just summarized. Again, this is in addition to the one on the prayer badges, as well as a dissident parrot in the city of Sfax. I was particularly struck by this story because of how it employed the symbols of the regime and its cult of personality. That cult was made up by statues and pictures of the number 7, jumbo posters of the president with service delivery messages, clock towers symbolizing the era of change when he came to power, as well as the ways in which the language and symbolism of the regime filtered into everyday practices, such as naming businesses and products. In my second book chapter, I engaged the symbolic representation of this day to ask, following political theorist and a dear friend of mine, Lisa Wedin, why a state invests in such a carnivalesque display of power. So So why does a state invest in such a carnivalesque display of power? One of the questions, if a state is relatively resource poor, why would public funds be diverted to the construction of this kind of political cult? In Lisa's work on Hafez al-Assad's cult of personality in Syria, that cult, particularly its ubiquitous presence and saturation of public space, paradoxically invites transgression. During Ben Ali's regime, tales like Mansouri Street exemplified how the public dimension of the cult of personality and collectively held fears of Tunisia's security apparatus were central to imagined and real transgressions. Many did not believe in the phoniness of the spectacles of power, which was precisely what the cult sought to achieve, or, if not believe, at the very least achieve obedience or quiescence. That the opposite was real, we observed just a few days into the 2011 revolution when citizens dramatically began destroying images of Ben Ali in public spaces across the nation. This, too, was the principal inspiration for an October 2011 electoral campaign by a newly founded civil society organization, which reconstructed a massive poster of the deposed leader overnight in the suburb of La Goulette. The following morning, horrified bypassers mounted the ramparts and destroyed the image, only to reveal a hidden message to get out and vote against dictatorship. These reactions are reminders of a system of fear, one in which omnipresent dictatorship sought to suffocate dissent. It too reminded of the experiences of economic and social alienation as a result of a shifting economic order towards neoliberalism, albeit heavily directed by regime cronies, and this shift began in the late 1970s, as well as the quashing of alternative political ideas beginning with independence from the French. Politically, resistance was approached and studied through the established opposition in Tunisia and exile, particularly the Ennahda movement and human rights activism, as well as direct critiques of the regime through consensual pacts signed by parties of different political orientations, manifestos, and declarations denouncing the violent character of dictatorship. Yet an imaginaire, such as that of Mansouri Street, did something else. It provided a powerful example of how Tunisians, unpersuaded by the Ben Ali regime, imagined bottom-up and sporadic acts of resistance, and also how repression against it would work. The imaginaire revealed the limitations of the state. Individual cyber-dissident acts did not occur in a political vacuum. Rather, each provoked, whether intended or not, a reaction by citizen and the state, thus duly engaging and encountering the constricting mechanisms of political censorship. In other words, the regime revealed its inability to fully saturate all space, either through coercion or persuasion, signaling to dissenters that they could push even further. This mode of doing politics between opponent and repressive apparatus, a powerful form of negotiation between state and society, constituted the mechanism by which political scientist James Scott writes, the making of a social space for dissident subculture could actually occur. Once publicly circulating within society, these moments marked, as Scott writes, the breaking of a taboo imposed by the dominant, or the public refusal to reproduce hegemonic appearances, declaring publicly that rules of subordination are neither legitimate nor decisive. That hegemony, the details of the RCD's mechanism, the RCD was the ruling party, mechanism of control and Ben Ali's repressive politics have been written about in great detail by other scholars, in particular Beatrice Hibou's The Force of Obedience, originally published in 2006 and republished after the revolution in English, translated, republished in 2012, I think, 11-12, and also Michel Camus and Vincent Geisser's The Authoritarian Syndrome, which was published in 2003. I add the symbolic representation and reach of the state to these analyses on the coercive mechanism to capture and theorize another level of defiance, as exemplified in this lecture. So briefly back to 2001 and the street which does not exist. For the readers and contributors to Tunisine, Mansouri Street was a metaphor for an open political space, a space which they inhabited and in which citizens could freely express their ideas and critiques. In my conversations with members of Tunisia's stirred opposition, which is what they called themselves, particularly E-Fighter and Omar Khayyam, the understanding of a free space encompassed both material and representational dimensions. In other words, the platform as a material space provided the possibility to think of its meaning for transgression, whether in the form of ideas, imaginations, or in real-life experiences. Marking the ability of these imaginaries to serve as an anti-Ben Ali focal point in Tunisia, the core contributors would at moments sign their jokes, skits, and commentaries as by an inhabitant of Mansouri Street. The need for a Mansouri Street, too, reflected the intensification of Ben Ali's security apparatus by the early 2000s, a time when his unlimited presidency became clear, state-led human rights violations were justified under global anti-terrorism legislative norms, and many of his early supporters had already defected. The absurdity of the tale served as a corrective to Tunisians who might have still believed at that time in the continuity of the period of openness that marked the early years of his rule from 1987 to 1990. That period, referred to in the official script as the Tunisian Spring or Awakening, in fact, and to many, never existed, despite its pervasive presence in the official narrative. Testimonies of citizens arrested as political opponents in the days immediately after the 1987 coup show that the security apparatus from the late Bourguiba years and its torture system never ceased to work. Within this context, imaginaires were drawn from both dreams of freedom from political persecution as well as from everyday encounters with the security elements of the Tunisian state under Ben Ali. And perhaps Beatrice Hibou's work is one of the strongest that explains what that everyday encounter and administrative control looked like in the 1990s mainly. The story of the street that does not exist captures these discordant experiences. So how does this analysis of one imaginaire, and I read all of them, which is incredibly exciting, it took a long time, fit into the broader structure of this book? So my book commences with a simple, perhaps evident statement, and I cite from the introduction. The modern political history of Tunisia is neither one of dictatorship, nor more recently, or exactly, one of democracy. At the very least, it is an experience of both, of how an alternative politics within dissent could survive and flourish under decades of dictatorship, and how consequently dictatorship has repositioned itself squarely within the country's experience of transition towards democracy since the revolution of 2011. Both historical processes, the solidification of dictatorship from the modernization experiment and largely single-party state regime of Tunisia's first president, Habib Bourguiba, to the neoliberal autocratic system buttressed by economic corruption and political repression of Ben Ali, are recounted from radically different perspectives and approaches. The system of repression paradoxically structured resistance in particular ways, and Anglophone studies of Tunisian politics primarily overlook this crucial dynamic of how repression formed dissent rather than entirely quashed it. The different book chapters provide as evidence a series of genealogical analyses of different forms of defiance to think about how these moments themselves transformed and expanded into the post-2011 period. In this sense, the book examines how dissent is structured, and in its second chapter begins with an analysis of the political cult of personality as a primary site of defiance. Because of the insistence on political obedience, I look at how the cult was used creatively by dissenters to mock its very purpose, but also to use its imagery and symbolism to forcefully critique the economic corruption and political repression that it sought to mask. Beyond the jokes that were told, the cartoons produced, tongue-in-cheek references to spectacles around national holidays, I too examined large-scale events that invited transgressions. The 2001 Mediterranean Games and multiple soccer matches, where fans from competing teams often came together to challenge state narratives of loyalty and national belonging. But also directly the police through song, chant, and sometimes violence, portraying their dismissal of agents that represented the state. In the third chapter, I detail regime mechanisms to control the official media and catalog two forms of defiance: subversion in official press, as well as an expanding human rights-based civil society and dissident-created imaginaires. In the 2000s, the opposition in exile signed with opponents in Tunisia multiple pacts and manifestos, and in my fourth chapter, I juxtapose these consensual agreements to street-based protest and social movements occurring at the same time in the Gafsa region and mining towns. Here, I trace histories of political ideologies and the transformation of grievances to demonstrate that though part of an archipelago, alternative politics or democracy meant radically different things to different people. and this is following the work of theorists Ian Shapiro and Frederick Schaeffer. Against this backdrop, I then examined the fifth chapter, an accumulation of street-based protests and rebellions, particularly in the 2008-2010 period, at the time of the global financial meltdown. Beginning with a 6-month-long rebellion in Gafsa, I write about large-scale moments of protest, an anti-censorship campaign in Tunis that was mobilized online, as well as a flash mob, a series of protests and strikes in Ben Garden in August of 2010, and finally the rapid mobilization of what became the revolutionary uprising of 2010 and 11. I pay particular attention to the differences in grievance, underlying political motivations and claims, as well as methods used to push against the regime. The 2008 rebellion in Gafsa was rooted in a different history of political economy around resource extraction and anti-colonial, leftist, nationalist, sovereigntist political mobilization and movements in urban centers around freedom of expression and political inclusiveness, for instance. The concluding chapter begins with a narration of the destruction of the cult of personality and a discussion of the thousands of protests and social movements that since erupted post-2011. When appropriate, I link these previous modes of contention, but also how we can read and map the limitations of the state today through protest. To go back to historian Michel Ralph Trouillot, who writes that what happens does not necessarily reflect that which is said to have happened, hinting at the competing analysis, observations, and rumors of what occurred at decisive historical moments. More than any other event since Tunisia's independence from France in 1956, the 2011 popular uprising opened the possibility to examine, experience, and relive the many narratives, their historical roots, and those humans who made these, as part of the process to reconfigure and reimagine a new politics. Our knowledge and reading about Tunisia's modern political history, as anywhere else, is the product of these competing narratives and the experiences of those constructing and living them. At the end, the study explores how these came about, by whom, and how they intersect with reigning narratives as well as methods of inquiry. It is but one of multiple contributions of these bundled silences that make up Tunisia's modern political history. Thank you very much. I forgot this one. I'm sorry. Here's your last political cartoon. Should I stay?
Thank you for providing such dreadful, but at the same time wonderful memories of contemporary history, and thank you for reminding us that imagination is such a powerful tool against dictatorship, against all forms of persecution. So now we'll take questions from the room. Please feel free to ask your question in any language. And yeah, who would like to ask the first question?
I'm Matt Wardner. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto and a lecturer literally behind that wall at the MSB. Laryssa, I was wondering if you can maybe connect some of the dots between your research prior to and what's going on now, despite the fact that you warn us against that. I'm particularly interested in the ways in which people who were very excited about the revolution, young people, leftists in particular, were really inspired by this idea that they could participate in democratic politics, and yet now find themselves disavowing of the system and not believing in its democratic nature. Do you see any connection between these sorts of imaginaries and types of protest, these modes of contention under dictatorship, to the kinds of politics in labor and leftist movements now that just don't believe in the kind of narrative that's being spouted, the democratic narrative that's coming out of Nida, Tunis, and
So, so the intervention about creating, so the idea of thinking about temporalities is that, so when you theorize time, it does a specific kind of work in any kind of social science or theoretical research. And the idea here was to warn against forging this kind of comparison, right? Forcing this kind of comparison, which makes sense for certain kind of questions. So Joy Beenan's work on unions and states make sense comparatively across space, Egypt and Tunisia, and comparatively across time as well in both cases. What I was more worried about, and I'll get to the substantive part of your question in just a moment, is the way in which social scientists are pushed to construct, to use that temporality to raise questions. And part of it is a critique that, it's obviously a very, that's a very specific political science critique that we don't get to do history. That we have to look at things that are currently happening and then model them in order to predict them in certain kind of ways. Which is fine, but there are other ways of thinking about politics as well. And one of them is this kind of genealogical approach, which then oftentimes conflates the study of history and political science, where political scientists are not necessarily trained in historiography and are able to do that. So we tack on case studies that kind of quickly summarizes incredibly complex moments. So to get to your question about how this has changed, of course things have changed, and that was my point. Like there's different ruptures across modern history, across histories in all cases, and this is not essentializing or singling out Tunisia. You can apply the same question to France right now, to the U.S., to Italy, to anywhere, right? There are certain kind of global trends, either political economic trends, demographic trends, service delivery trends. An article by Melanie Cammett and her team of researchers recently published a great piece on social protest being kind of the cause of protest is the retreat of the state and the inability to provide social services, which is not an Arab world phenomenon, right? We just see kind of like a rise of protest right now, but this is a global phenomenon. So I do think that there is a difference in the way in which you mobilize under a system of repression than you do in other systems. There's clearly a difference. You can publish differently, you can protest legally, you can apply for protest permits, you can do things that you can't necessarily do in other systems. But I don't think that the dynamics per se are different, because the larger global trends, whether the economic systems or other demographic changes, are still the same. So by kind of disconnecting that from what's been going on. So like disconnecting, I think, for instance, disconnecting 2010, 2011 from 2008 doesn't make much sense. Yet the kind of binary that we create by starting our analysis with the rupture of 2011 makes us think of these other movements as a different temporality rather than a continuity of a response to what I think is a global financial crisis, perhaps. So it depends on the question.
Hi, my name is Yassine. I work around here. Thank you so much for the presentation, first of all, and you totally had me with that story in the beginning. I believed it because I wanted to believe it, I guess. Because, as you've mentioned, the modes of dissent prevalent in Tunisia before 2011 are mostly unaccounted for, in a sense, because you said it was located in the imaginary, where the imaginary is, by definition, not written down. It exists in a mental space. Oh, sorry. Can everybody hear me if I speak like this? Okay. All right. So my question is, other than the overt rebellion acts in 2008 in the mining belt and the other ones that you mentioned in Benguerdin and the southern border with Libya in 2010, I was wondering whether you have come across in your research, or if it's mentioned in the book, whether other types of overt dissent in Tunisia that are not relative to the specific concerns of an area that is being pillaged without the local inhabitants getting the resources, such as in Gafsa, or issues related to border border economy with Libya. I was wondering if you had seen any beyond the imaginary, what has dissent looked like in maybe the everyday lived life of people in Tunisia, given that, my own experience as a Tunisian and my own knowledge is that, under a super repressive police state, there is no space for any kind of dissent, if not in the imaginary or under the veil of anonymity online.
Okay. So the answer is yes. So the imaginaries are just one part, a part of this kind of larger dissident subculture that formed. And I picked one imaginaries out of, I think there's 189 Tunisian copies. It ran for 5 years. And it certainly didn't only publish imaginaries, it published communiques from outlaw political parties and manifestos and articles that were banned or censored in Tunisia as well. And it also had a chat kind of discussion forum, which perhaps was its most dynamic part, that the state also oftentimes tried to infiltrate. It's one of many forms of dissent, and it's towards the end of the book that I turn to the more kind of things that we identify as rebellions and protests. But what I didn't want to do is a kind of event analysis and just register them. I wanted to see what they meant in those particular areas, what they meant and how the logics were different. And that is for 2 reasons. And here I'm going to admit to huge disciplinary limitations. I'm a classic trained American political scientist. And we are taught that there are 2 kinds of systems. There are democracies and there's dictatorships. And politics happen in certain ways under democracies and in certain ways under dictatorships. And then as graduate students, we're kind of dispatched into the field and we're supposed to go and identify them. So we're supposed to go and talk to civil society organizations and political parties and oppositional actors and kind of come up with a theory of what change could look like. That is essentially what a lot of comparative politics in the US looks like with different methodologies. And so what happens is when you start encountering what is actually happening, because your literature tells you there's nothing happening. So if you look at public opinion surveys on Tunisia from, say, 2004, some that were conducted here, or when they tried to conduct them, you see very little, you kind of see this reproduction of an image of political quiescence, and you have to write against that. So of course what you do is you go and you try to find what is identifiable. So anytime you see a protest, you want to try to understand what it's about, even if it's a regime-sponsored protest. So my point of focusing on dissent is not to kind of do a listing of everything that happened, but more to theorize under which conditions it formed and against what kind of repressive mechanisms. And here is where I found work by critical theorists in political science more interesting than the tools in comparative politics, because they tell you, so everyone's work breaks down. You do your research project just completely breaks down because you imagine also that you will find something that you don't find. And also research is already a strange kind of endeavor because you're running around as a foreigner asking people to talk about their lived experiences, which is bizarre. So once you kind of get to the point and understand what the question actually is, you can start paying attention to why it forms in those specific ways. And the reason why I used this particular imaginaire, because it got me too the first time I read it. And I forced my husband to drive me out to Nabel, and we were trying to find the hotel, and we were trying to find the street, because it seems so real. This one seems less real than some of the other imaginaires in there, and it does a specific kind of use of the symbolism. So it shows precisely how the symbolism is used to kind of in a carnivalesque way turn the ideas of the system upside down. And that is something that you don't find very often in studies of kind of political opposition and resistance. So it's but one of many. Yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and it's quite illuminating to hear about the various stories of resistance. I was wondering if you can tell us a bit more about the hegemonic aspect of Ben Ali's rule. In other words, who was supporting him amidst the people there? I mean, what's the other side of the story? What kind of social groups, and how was this kind of protest socially located in that milieu?
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I read during the period, and again, this is a media control. This is information that is controlled by the system. Is that the party had 2 million supporters, official supporters, which is something that was questioned, obviously, because it wasn't clear, kind of, where these. The numbers were produced by the regime, so it wasn't clear. It also wasn't clear where support begins and ends. Do you have to be an official member, or do you have to be a cadre of the state, or kind of where does this like loyalty and obedience start and end? What I think is really fascinating. So if you in my second chapter, I juxtaposed two things. So there is a celebration of the November 7th holiday, the day he came to power, and there was a certain kind of eeriness about how empty it was. So the city would kind of light up in all the cult paraphernalia, but there was very little beyond a regime orchestrated kind of march or spectacle celebrating this ascension to power, as well as a tour that the president would do, and certain kind of requirements by students in schools to recite the declaration. And but it seemed eerie. Then 2 days later, there was a massive soccer game, and this is not to kind of over romanticize soccer, because I know we love to do that, especially in non-Western societies. But during that game, so during the November 7th celebration, the president delivered a speech in the soccer stadium in Rades that was constructed for the 2001 Mediterranean Games. And there you could see the television kind of cameras focusing on him and supporters that all looked the same. They all wore the same kind of red scarf, but they were kind of trying not to inch to show that the whole thing was actually empty, right? So it's a completely orchestrated kind of stuff. There's a lot of work on these kind of orchestrated spectacles in the Hafiz al-Assad case and studies of North Korea and so on. So there was definitely an orchestration behind it, which perhaps was an indication that the membership or the loyalty to the party was overblown, also because of the 4 strategies that were used for people to kind of, show their loyalty, whether it's buying party tickets or whether it's paying a tax or other such means. Then 2 days later, you have a packed stadium, very different thing going on with fans singing against that, using the language of the official script, of the official narrative of loyalty, of progress, of nationalism in their own chants. So you see that there's this kind of like discordance between what public assembly and what loyalty necessarily looks like. It's kind of a difficult argument to make, because you don't want to say that, oh, people don't support a dictatorial regime, but they support a soccer team, which is kind of popular literature. But there was this kind of shifting dynamic that indicated that the support for that regime might have been overblown. Then 2011 happens, and I was convinced that there were not many supporters of the previous regime. And then suddenly you see former regime members popping up all over the place and making their ways back into politics, like whether in the form of new political parties or university positions, still kind of celebrating the 7th of November, still orchestrating events, having anti-January 14th marches. So it's interesting to see, for me, how much bigger the support for that regime was than I thought. And one thing that I don't know, and I don't know how we could kind of scientifically get at this, is whether this is real or whether this is a complete distortion of what happened with the media post-2012 and 2013. So in 2012, 2013, there were a number of security incidents in Tunisia, and right away, the media that was still controlled by kind of former regime members started publishing public opinion surveys that ask questions like, was it better before than after? But you can ask that question anywhere, and people will always tell you it was better before. That has little to do with that kind of system, but that would make the headlines. And so this popular narrative really took hold, that there was something safer and something better and something more secure about the previous regime, which I find very kind of problematic. And I don't know whether the roots are necessarily in the actual loyalty for the previous regime, or whether this is something that was constructed post, I would say, 2012, 2013.
Laryssa, I'm sorry to use my power to take somebody else's power on this mic.
Yeah.
I jump on Aniket's question. So, who was supporting Ben Ali, but then who was opposing Ben Ali?
Specifically?
Yeah, specifically. Who are the people in the Archipelagos? What makes you an opponent to
Oh,
Ben Ali?
okay.
Yeah.
Well, if you say you're an opponent to the so I think it's really important to listen to what people say. So when they say that they are opposing something, that's when we understand that they're opposing something. I think it's pretty clear that the writers in something like Tunisine opposed it. I think it's clear that the political kind of oppositional movements that signed the pacts in 2001 and 2003 and in 2005 and again in 2006 were opposed to the regime. So it's when you say it, which is oftentimes, which is because it's really hard for political science to make assumptions like, and this is for those who know Lisa Bedin's work, this is the criticism of her work that she makes claims about all Syrians. So no Syrians believe in the cult of personality of Hafez al-Assad. You know, they make these kind of statements about how everyone believes, how everyone thinks, which is really, Laura is laughing because she took a class with her at the University of Chicago. But it's really kind of hard to get at that. So for me, it's someone who actually says it. And what was surprising is how many people said it. So, yeah.
I don't know if this works. Hi, I'm a PhD student at Harvard, but I'm from here, so very triggering memories. I really liked your talk, and I was thinking about how imaginaries produce dissent, but they also produce forms of paranoia that allowed forms of self and collective disciplining that imagined almost the state as more powerful than it actually was, and the regime as more powerful than it actually was, and kind of imagined the state as a sort of panopticon that could even look into people's houses. I mean, there are so many stories of like, I remember like I was talking to my parents and they were like, remove your phone batteries because someone will hear you, but no. And there's a good literature on that, on kind of the dominated that exceeds the hopes of the powerful. Like Malcolm X writes about it, Fanon writes about it. So I was thinking about how kind of we can imagine both these imaginaries of dissent, but also these imaginaries of kind of paranoia that produced, that kind of produced a buying into regime, and that allowed other imaginaries, like the imaginary of like everyone is middle class, or the imaginary of economic freedom to kind of flourish, rather than imagining the state as kind of people for the regime or against the regime. So I don't know if you could speak about it.
No, that's great. That's a just very interesting comment. Okay, so what I really like about Beatrice Hibou's study is that when she's trying to, and this is something that was, did you follow the hearings of the Truth Commission of the EVD? So I think this comes out very strongly in the hearings, is how there was a systematic kind of control that was felt by everyone. So felt by everyone in the way that either you were punished by it because you had been, which obviously came out in the testimonies of the former political prisoners, that the sentence really started once they left prison, right? Once they left prison and were placed under long periods of administrative and very humiliating control. And then at the same time, you have the lived experience of dealing with issues such as the credit system and contributing to a narrative of an economic miracle story of a phony middle class that is created by the state, which many middle classes, by the way, are phony and created by the state. So again, like I tried to really not essentialize this case in this way, but that were also touched by that kind of system because of the because of the criminality that was associated with not paying your debts in time and so on. So I think you're right that there is definitely a, I think the Imaginaires in particular, because I love symbolic representations of power, make it something bigger than they really are. But I think that does a really important work. And it kind of allows the readers to see it in different ways. So there was another question about, I forgot what it was, maybe it was Matt, about the different types of dissent. So I didn't start looking at the actual cult, the symbolic representation, until multiple months into my research, because it just didn't matter to me. It was irrelevant. It was just kind of there. Until talking to people who said, no, but look, this is what it's doing. So what the imaginaire does, it blows it out of proportion, but there is a politics behind it. And the politics is to touch, kind of to get at everyday citizens and make clear that this is the kind of system that is in place. I'm sorry to make this comparison because I happen to be American, but I think in many ways we're doing that with, depending on what side of politics we're on in the US, we're doing that in the US right now as well. So we're kind of blowing out of proportion a lot of stuff that is happening in order to create a sensationalism around what seems to be a very illiberal politics, so that we actually start thinking about it. And it works in the terms of mobilization and social movement and political consciousness. So I think the Imaginaires did that. But I agree with you that they can blow things out of proportion. And I think the state is felt very differently by Omar Khayyam, who was a postal worker and then went to Montreal, as opposed to, you know, a political prisoner in Gafsa who spent 16 years in solitary confinement and then was placed under administrative control. So those are different encounters, and I try to theorize them together as that experience.
Thanks, Laryssa. Amazing that you also brought up sort of the crazy things that are happening in the US, because that's exactly where I'm going to. And thank you again for being here. It was wonderful to listen to you and learn from you. Okay, how do I start? So your discussion about this creation of narrativizing and creating imaginaries and stuff. I can't help but think, and this can be totally erroneous because I'm also the product of this like crazy binary American political science methodology, of how these like similar things are also happening, have been happening for many, many years, also in the US. So we also have narrativizing, we also have imaginaries, and I'm wondering, it's sort of a question but also a comment, I'd just like to hear your thoughts. Maybe you could speak to what the work that different imaginaries might do, like maybe if we're comparing between comparing these two cases, and the different, like if we're gonna go back to the amazing title, I love it, the different sort of archipelagos of dissent that they might create. So I recognize, okay, obviously notwithstanding all the different historical, cultural, political factors that differentiate these two cases, the US and Tunisia obviously, but I'm wondering what you might think about, you know, similar narrativizing, similar imaginaries, like the American flag, like troops, like, you know, freedom, whatever, you know? And I'm wondering what sorts of movements for dissent, you know, they might create, right, as sort of reactions to that. So, awesome. Thanks.
Before I answer, when anyone has a moment, can I have a pen from anyone? Thanks. It's because sometimes I forget there's two parts to the question. So I did a book workshop, and in the book workshop a year ago, they asked me, is this a Middle East studies book or political science book? And I'm like, this is a Middle East studies book. Because I have a hard time sometimes talking to, except for my very awesome friends in political science, to some political scientists. And they said, no, this has to be a political science book, because it's not about, it's of course the inspiration for it, the field of inquiry is Tunisia, but it's about major concepts in the study of political science, and particularly how we approach state. So what I think the imaginaries do in this case, and probably in other cases as well, they show us in a very legible and easy to understand way the limitations of the state. Because when we think about the limitations of the state, kind of from reading the newspaper, it's about social service delivery, or it's about the retreat of the state, or it's about the privatization of the state, or it's about the neoliberalization of the state. But what these imaginaries do, they really create a scenario that we can imagine we're in, and make us understand how that state can touch on everyday lives. And again, I wish there were more I mean, I think we do have them, like maybe Vice News. I'm trying to think about, where in the US these kind of spaces are for this, but they're really popular, right? This idea of humor, they're humoristic in many ways. So humor and sarcasm, also in political science, has been theorized in many ways, kind of like what kind of work humor, what kind of work imaginary does in imagining, or even kind of having an idea of what the end of that kind of state would look like. So I prefer, oftentimes at the end of the day, to read some kind of ridicule of Trump. I'm obviously not hiding my politics. Than to kind of follow the day-to-day kind of discussions that are occurring around specific things. So it serves in many ways, I think, as both an outlet, but also points to the very limitations of a state in a system where information was simply not that readily available. But so the imaginaires are part of platforms, and there's other stuff happening on these platforms. And what I think is really interesting, at one point, circa 2003, I might be wrong, oppositional actors, especially those living either in the diaspora, or who had come back, or who had been arrested and left and come back, or who went on Mustakila, for instance, become kind of major figures in the imaginaries. And they take on political roles in really interesting ways. The reason why I left a lot of this stuff out, it's in the chapters, is because when you mention a name like Sihim Ben Sidrin, what we think about today is Truth Commission, criticism, character issues, infighting within the Truth Commission, or someone who did an extraordinary job. But there's a certain kind of image that comes with it post her work in starting with the transitional justice process of Tunisia. She is an extraordinary, fascinating character in these stories. She has these ideas of she symbolizes women, she symbolizes a lioness, she symbolizes a form of mobilization, a former publishing house in her apartment in downtown Tunis. There's a lot in there. There's different roles that they play then afterwards. So I kind of left that discussion out because of it's really easy to say that name in a talk at University of Texas in Austin because no one knows her. I know. But you also know Tunisia. So I think it's also where these actors became really important. So there's a kind of real imagination of what their political role will look like. And I wish, I don't have my manuscript with me, but there's one imaginaire where she is leading a protest on Carthage. And it's written on January 14th of 2003. There's these really weird coincidences that happen. And I think once you connect them all together, you kind of really see what the support for that kind of opposition would have looked like as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk.
Oh, hi.
Yeah, just right here. I just wanted to ask if you, or if your analytical framework includes cyberspace as an extension of the field of dissent, and probably pick up your thoughts on the intersection between technology, like surveillance, cyber surveillance technology, and new politics and the region.
What is necropolitics?
Like post-revolution politics
okay.
in the region.
Okay, so I know someone who did really phenomenal work on that, and I forget his name, so I don't do it. And I try not to do causality between internet usage and political mobilization. What I do have is throughout the chapters, numbers when internet usage increases significantly, and how that kind of maps on social movement, but I don't want to necessarily draw that causality because I think that the way in which online platforms and the internet in particular is used in mobilization works very differently in different areas. I say this all the time, that things work differently. But what I mean by that is in 2010, in May of 2010, there was a large e-mobilization campaign in Tunis. And it was by cyber activists. So the generation of the Tunisian people plus some of their friends put together this anti-censorship campaign and clearly used the internet to mobilize. Very clearly used the internet. During the 2008 rebellion in Gafsa, internet was not clearly used, but Gafsa had support groups in the diaspora that would publicize what was going on during that 6 months rebellion elsewhere, so that it would make its way into other news sources. So I think that the internet functions in different ways around the question of mobilization and political contention. What I do think is interesting is how internet usage, I believe, and I'm going to be wrong on these numbers right now, more than doubled from 2008 to 2010, I think. And then after 2011, the censors were completely removed for a short period and then replaced. But there is a bit of there's a bit of an observation bias, because I was here in 2008 to 2010, so that's what it looked like to me. And I don't know what it necessarily looked like before. But the numbers, I mean, the internet usage increases significantly by 2008, 2009, and 2010 from previous years as well. I will remember the person who did that study, if that's something that interests you.
Thank you, Laryssa. There's one person from UT Austin that knows Siham bin Sidreen, but
I was just thinking about my last talk.
what was your talk? I didn't even.
November.
My question follows up on what you were saying, actually, about doing research then and then talking about it today, and trying not to have this false sense of time and stopping time in 2010, 2011 and starting over.
Mm-hmm.
So my question as a researcher is, your writing is before the revolution, and you're still working on your book today that's hopefully coming out and we'll all buy it. What has that experience been like, working on something before the revolution, and then in political science and political sociology, where I am, the sexy topic is today, after the revolution. What has that been like? How do you continue to shed light on the important politics of dissent then, today? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So there are movements that are clearly connected. And I do that in the last chapter. They're very, very clearly connected, and they claim roots in. So, I mean, the mining region is so incredibly fascinating, because the deeper you dig, the deeper there's you get at really interesting stuff around digging into political ideology and kind of solidarities with the Algerian FLN. And so there's a certain kind of political narrative that is recounted that makes sense, that continues to be recounted today. And that is true of other forms of dissent as well. The thing is, so this is going to be really procedural. There are two ways of thinking about a book. One is quickly publish your dissertation, or take some time and think about it, and also work a lot. So the book project is, there's probably 5% of the dissertation left, and what this is right now. Right, so even though the research is from before, it's through that kind of lens. But most of the stuff I've chucked, and because, and I think I tried to say it early on, the project is expanded in scope because of the possibility to talk to people that we were not able to talk to before. And by expanding that, there's two things that happen. One, you get lots of more different narratives, more ideas of how it started, more kind of explanations of where these moments of contentions come from, what they do, from different voices, from different actors. That's one part. The other thing is, and this is something that for those where you're right, it's sexy to write about, because people were asking, where's the book in 2012? We want it in 2013. Where is this? Why are you not writing a book on this political movement? Why are you not doing this political movement? You're like, because I'm doing something different. And one of the things about time is that, believe it or not, but people's opinions change. And we don't have, in political science, necessarily the tools to capture that. So when someone's ideas or engagement or commitment to a specific political ideal changes over time, how do we capture that when we do something that is very much, specific within one moment? When it's either, a survey capturing some. So by the way, I didn't mean to dismiss binaries or mainstream political science work. I think it's phenomenal, and lots of people do really, really amazing work. I just think that sometimes we overlook other things that are going on, which is some of this stuff.
Thank you, Laryssa. It was a very informative talk. My question is actually a follow-up question on all the previous ones. Have you examined in your book other forms of dissent, like the politics of mockery and irony at the grassroots levels, like the popular jokes and what they would say and internalize? And would you say that actually these politics of mockery was a way of distancing ourselves from the reality to allow certain consciousness a certain political resistance to grow?
Yes. So I registered about, I don't know, somewhere between like 50 and 80 jokes over the time. The problem with integrating jokes in a manuscript is unless they are specific about the argument. So I have a freedom of expression joke about a dog on the Algerian border. I have another one about the cult. I have another one about the Ibn Khaldun statue. But what happens is with all these jokes, they're really difficult to translate to a non-specialized, non-Tunisian audience. So they mean very, very, very little. And the editors oftentimes is the first thing that they cut. But yes, jokes are definitely part. And Tunisia, by the way, is also a place where in every issue there were multiple jokes published. The other thing, and this is a conversation I've been having again with my friend Lisa Wadeen, is her new book on Syria is coming out any day now. She's the one who really, we've had a conversation about how to theorize humor and how to place humor in there, because the reality is there's nothing funny about dictatorship. And you don't want to cross that line of kind of mocking something when you're talking about really horrendous lived conditions. She's encountered this issue because she writes on Syria, and she's looking at at comedies in the form of what do they call it? Soap operas in Syria, where they're kind of doing again this, these Bakhtin kind of turning the social order upside down and mocking the Assad regime. And when she presented the work early on, one of the criticisms was this is not funny in light of what's going on. So one of the things about stepping a little bit away from the humor and focusing on the humor that exemplifies the theory, which is the symbolism of the regime is used to transgress it, is really difficult for a very, very, very specialized audience. But yeah, the short answer is absolutely. And I personally enjoyed them. And there's a great dissertation coming out by one of Charles Tripp's students that is looking just at jokes in Tunisia from an anthropological perspective as well. It's great.
Laryssa, thanks so much for this presentation. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about dissent and the regime, because I feel like they're sort of in this binary. And in a sense, I feel like, I mean, the way you sort of described regime at the beginning, it's the regime success is in some way gaining consent, right? It's almost like this prime actor that's trying to get consent, either coercively or through other means. And then dissent is almost a subordinate. I mean, the agency is really, the prime agency is with the regime, and then the subordinate agency is with the dissenter. Yep. And immediately when I hear the word dissenter or dissent, I think of a victim. I think of I think of I'm already thinking of dictatorship, or I'm already thinking of an authoritarian system. I'm not thinking of a dissenter in Sweden. Although maybe we should, I don't know. So my question was sort of, the other language that we've seen a lot of people studying in Tunisia, or you mentioned Biden, is like resistance. I mean, resistance is, I guess, a term that in some ways maybe we immediately think of it having more agency than dissent, dissent versus consent. How do you approach the relationship between dissent and resistance?
Okay, so the word I chose is interstitial protest. So it's the kind of moments that rupture. And resistance, so there's no Foucault in here because I'm not a Foucauldian, and it's too simplistic of an application of where there's power, there's resistance, and everywhere there's power, there's resistance, and resistance is always there. I mean, it's a way too simplistic kind of application of that binary that you mentioned. So dissenting to me is non-compliance with the regime in any form, in any kind of form, whether in the form of a joke or writing an imaginary, or sitting in a cafe and saying something about the person, or publishing, subverting something in the official script, or singing against the police in a soccer stadium, or singing against the police during a protest. These are different forms of dissent to me. Resistance in kind of my reading is still very organized in a way. It doesn't need to be, it can be organized in the Asif Bayat term. It can be a non-social movement, but it's organized around a specific grievance that can have a political, that can be of political nature. But it's not a sporadic act of defiance. It's part of a larger project, larger political project, larger political economic project, in most ways.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering about the relationship between the imaginaries and fake news, because it seems like what makes the imaginaries so powerful is this lack of information or accurate information, because something could be believed or could not be disproved. And I think to the US context, where with fake news it's much the same way. People see something that they want to believe or don't believe the official information, and thus the narrative is driven by this sort of fake news story. And I was wondering if, considering the Tunisian context, where maybe if the fake news is coming from the state, then the imaginary is the response.
The answer is yes. The fake news, it's interesting because does anyone know kind of when the term fake news started entering public discourse? Like 4 years ago? 1917. Okay. No, but when fake news actually became an object of study, but you're right, 1917. I think there's something really interesting about the dynamic of when fake news is so fake. Okay, so in the US, there's a discussion of competing notions and epistemologies of truth. So what is truth to one person might not be true to another person, and vice versa. And oftentimes these truths are based on emotions, simply because we can never be wrong about an emotion, right? So there's that kind of thing that's going on. I don't think that was the case here. At least that's my reading of how fake news functions right now. It's very kind of emotion. It's driven by emotion. It's driven by fear, oftentimes. On the one side, fear of the Trump regime and fear of what happens to institutions. On the other hand, of fear to what immigration and other kind of things that we try to protect do. My reading of the official press here was, yes, it was fake news. But I think there was very little disagreement that it was in fact fake news. And in part because it was so legible. I mean, the picture is on the paper every day. It's the same picture. The stories kind of mirror and echo what is in the official speeches and the official narrative. So you wouldn't necessarily go to the newspaper for news. You will go there for the real estate section or for the sales section, but you wouldn't necessarily go to the newspaper to find out kind of investigative news, which I think is different from how we are experiencing fake news right now, because there are competing camps that are making pretty extraordinary truth claims, which in that case was a more kind of unitary thing. But yes, I think there's a very clear relationship between the two. Thank you.
Thank you again, Laryssa, for this. I'm going to build off Fadil's point on dissent, because I kept thinking also throughout your talk about dissent and how you're conceptualizing dissent in the case of pre-2011 Tunisia, and what this could tell us about dissent as a mode of as a modality. And you talk about the modes of dissent. So if you can talk a little bit about how you're conceptualizing these different modes. What does it mean? A mode of dissent, is sarcasm and mockery, for example, one mode, versus everyday resistance, ala bayt, where is another mode. So if you can talk about that. And I also couldn't help but think about try to understand the relationship between dissent and the nature of political power in Tunisia. And I know you just said you're not a Foucauldian, so we can't so dissent or resistance isn't necessarily diagnostic of the type of power that is operative in this case. But I'm going to go back to something you said at the beginning of the nature of power being benevolent. And Beatrice Ibou talked about the duality of power. The repressive hand is also the benevolent. The hand that tortures is also the hand that gives. I'm very interested in that, and you bring it out very clearly here. But if you can talk a little bit more about the nature of power before 2011 and this benevolence, how is that linked to these modes of dissent? So you argue that repression is generative of dissent, but also how dissent is also produces certain modes of power and so on. Benevolent. Thank you.
So I thought that the benevolent element. So I look at the benevolent element through the symbolic representation and the language of the cult, which has that element very clearly in it, in the form of a ubiquitous social service delivery message, inclusiveness, nationalism. So kind of creating categories of belonging, as long as you are a loyal citizen, or as long as the regime reads you to be a loyal citizen. And I think that becomes really clear in the cult, which, I'm sorry, I just gave a few pictures of statues and things to kind of go along with the presentation, but that certainly is not the limitation of the cult. It's in practice, it's in the language, it's in speeches, it manifests itself in textbooks, it manifests itself in very different ways where this benevolent message comes through very clearly. And so it's through that. So when you kind of look at the work on the coercive apparatus in the Middle East, which does two things. One, again, in Western political science, it singles out the Middle East as somehow having different coercive apparatuses than different parts of the world, which already is problematic. But the other thing that it does, it only looks at resistance to, or kind of contention against that coercive apparatus, which then goes to the, you think of victim, as opposed to a lived system. And I think that Beatrice Ibou kind of touches on that, on the lived system, but she doesn't actually get very much, because this is not, I don't like criticizing work for what they don't do. I like criticizing work for what they do. So I think she does a phenomenal job in her study. But one of the things that she doesn't get at, because it's not part of her interest, she's a political economist / political economy ethnographer, is the way in which that benevolent narrative of the state, in addition to the repressive coercive apparatus, creates the kind of hatred and creates the kind of, from dissent to resistance, forms against it. Because that kind of combination simply doesn't work. And I think the person who probably does it best is Hamza Medeb and his work on Ben Garden, because he looks at precisely, not in the form of resistance, or some of it is, but how the self-help economy around informality formed because of precisely the language of the state that was absent, and then the real absence of the state as well. So.
My question deals with the concept of memory. And you mentioned one of the benefits in continuing your work now is that you're able, or you have access to more respondents, and you can analyze information that you previously didn't just have access for. How do you deal with just the impact of memory if someone's remembering an event differently, if they seem to overstate the dissent or understate it, and how do you factor that into your analysis?
So this is what happened and what continues to happen. But so there are multiple ways that I deal with it. So one, I acknowledge that our positionality changes, and I acknowledge that our kind of views of the world also fundamentally change over time, including, which sometimes is based on our institutional kind of arrangements that we're in, or sometimes we just happen to shift how we change, how we think about something, which is a normal thing, except for when you do research, an interview kind of research, where somehow it doesn't become normal anymore, and the person is supposed to think the same way over and over and over and over and over again. So the way that I deal with it is, on the kind of easy side, is I just take as a contribution to evidence what they say. So what is publicly stated is what they say, and I'm not going to deal with whether it's true or not, whether it's overstated or not, or whether it's happening for a particular kind of purpose. Because I don't think that that's our work as researchers. I think there are other areas in which that kind of relationship can be explored, but at the end of the day, and this happened with a lot of my, a lot of the individuals that I started speaking with from the early days of my research through today, they have radically changed positions in the sense that they were unionists and they organized large-scale rebellions, and then they were elected to parliament. And so their language changes in a way. And I don't think of that as problematic, because it depends on the moment that I'm trying to explain. So when I'm trying to explain what happened between 2001 and 2008 in Gafsa, for instance, which is an extraordinarily interesting period. Gafsa, by the way, also should not be reduced, I think, in many ways to 2008. And Joel Bainen's student, Rebecca Gruskin, is writing a beautiful history dissertation on the kind of connection between the local and the global of what's going on in that specific region. But there's extraordinary stuff that was happening with individuals changing as these events unfold. So what I tried to do is capture that in the kind of genealogical analysis of what's going on and put it together with other kind of structural shifts that are happening. So this sounds very kind of research kind of whatever, like a language that is not accessible. So the story of a person that I've been talking to for now 8 years, his first engagement was in a small strike. And he was upset because of hiring practices. And the strike was organized in 2003 at the local branch of the Steg in Redeev, which is a mining town outside of Gafsa. And part of the strike, they threatened to hold on to the electrical lines until, there was a different protest and they had turned off all the electricity. So they were holding on, and the threat was if they don't stop the strike, they will actually turn on the currents. And what happened is they turned off the currents and electrocuted too. So his engagement in protest changed, or in these moments, changed. I don't think that's necessarily problematic for the analysis. And perhaps later he had overstated his leadership, because in 2008, a lot of his friends were arrested. When you go to Redeev and you talk to people, they say 2008 is the year that the whole town went to prison, and he is one of the ones that didn't go to prison. Now, does that mean that he necessarily overstated his political engagement? No. It just means that there is a kind of arc, there's a kind of time to his political participation that is really important for us to understand how those modes evolved over time. That's kind of how I deal with it. Because I don't want to get into this whole thing like, oh, but you said that before. I'm like, well, I also changed my opinion sometimes. So.
Thank you so much, Laryssa, for your speech and talk. It's really interesting. I'm a student at CMES, Master Student Second Year. My name is Ola. I'm interested in, you just mentioned the future, like my question is future-oriented. So how do you imagine Tunisia in 10 years from now, based on your research? I know, or maybe 5 years, how do you see politically, socially, the country changing?
Oh my God.
I know, it's a big question.
Intisar, help. Someone help. No, I mean, okay.
You don't have to answer.
No, I'll try. So I think there's certain kind of trends, again, okay, I'll try to tie this into, there are certain kind of trends that have been intensifying, and I think they're really interesting to look at. So I think global economic changes and political economy is a really interesting indicator of what's happening to basically the study of the state. So I think it depends on the question that you're looking at. I think if one is interested in the study of civil society, for instance, there's a clear trend that civil society has become professionalized, and there's a kind of managerial argument or criticism of it. That the activists, this is the, I forget her name, she teaches at Columbia, who wrote a beautiful piece about what happens when you go from activism into civil society work, and then you become managerial and almost technocratic, and you prep yourself for entry into a technocracy, which leads me to government. So there's a clear kind of trajectory towards technocracy and excellence. I think what's going to happen is that that's going to continue breeding the kind of resistance that we have been witnessing over the last couple of years, which is up to 16,000 instances of protest and strikes and suicide attempts, right? So I think you will continue seeing that kind of trajectory unless there's some radically different approach to either the economic or the political, which is difficult for a country that is not necessarily Algeria, that is not as sovereigntist as Algeria, that is very much dependent on global political and economic actors. But that's kind of how I would think about it, looking at those trends. That's great. Welcome.
Thank you very much, everyone. What's left to say is that we're very much looking forward to read the book. Thank you. To have it in our hands. And